In Orkney, we used to have an expression, "I'll be Ower with the moon," meaning that I would come and visit you when the moon is full to light my way.
Hello, folks, and welcome to another one of the Orkneyology podcasts, Ower with the Moon. The moon is shining brightly in the sky. Well, I assume it is. We can't see it at this northerly latitude at this time of year. It's too much daylight, so. But we assume it's still there. Tides are still coming in and out, so therefore I assume that it's still on the go.
I'm sure it's fine.
Yeah. Now, the last time I was telling you Orkney customs about births and courtship, and we were going to do marriage and death as well, but we ran out of time. That was your fault. You're just blethering too much.
I know. Too many questions.
It wasn't me fault at all, because I don't speak too much.
That's what makes it interesting, though.
Well, I hope so.
All the
I have no
extra
idea.
little details.
Yeah, I don't know whether it's interesting or just irksome.
Well, if it's irksome, people won't listen.
Well, I suppose. And if they do, it's their own fault.
That's right.
Yeah. Well, we are glad that you listen, because, it would be just sitting here speaking to ourselves. Otherwise, that would be a bit weird. Anyway, I suppose we should actually focus rather than just blithering on.
Yes.
But
so about weddings.
Marriage, yes. Well, if you have gone down on one knee and proposed to the one you love, that wasn't the end of it. That was only the beginning. Because the first thing that you had to do was to seek permission from the bride's father to get married. And that was called speerin night. Now, to spear has got nothing to do with sharp sticks. It's just the Orkney word meaning to ask. You spear somebody. You're asking them. It's spoor in Shetland, I believe. But it'll be an Old Norse thing, no doubt. So on spearin night, you had to go and see the bride's father to ask for his daughter's hand in marriage. And he didn't turn up light-handed, because you brought with you a bottle of whiskey, and usually as well a loaf of bread, because it meant that the deal could be sealed with a dram. The loaf of bread was symbolic, meaning that you were able to provide for his daughter and be able to make sure that she has plenty to eat, which is important in those days when, real poverty, So, spearin night didn't always go that smoothly. There was a story about a young man in Sandy who had fallen in love with a girl. She had, instead of the "will you marry me" routine, it was usually that you express your interest, of would you marry me? You'll have to spear me feather. So it was down to him as to whether he thought you were a good match or not. And I dare say that the women of the house had some influence over him as well,
I dare say
actually.
they did.
But that was just the convention.
Right.
So along you would pop, anyway. And this guy went along the one night, and he was so tongue-tied, he was so nervous that he couldn't bring himself to ask the feather for the daughter's hand in marriage. And he hummed and he had, and eventually he left late at night. And he'd done this for a couple of nights without being able to pluck up the courage to ask. And on the third night, he was there until late again, when he finally, probably with sort of stares and hand gestures from his beloved, standing in the doorway, kind of looking around the corner and going, "Get on with it." He said to the old man, would you come outside with me a minute? Because he was wanting to ask him away from, everybody else. And the old man says, "I've taken off me rivlins," which is the untanned hide shoes, but like moccasins that folk in Orkney wore. Says, "I've taken off me rivlins," he said, "and it's cold out there, and I'm going to bed soon, and I don't want to get cold before I go to bed. So whatever you have to say to me, you can say it to me here." And he sort of blurts out, it's kind of like, can I marry your Maggie? And he said, "Yes, I have no objections about that, boy. But," he says, "I'll bet that when you're married, you'll find that Maggie has a longer tongue than you do, boy." So she wouldn't be short of a word or two, whereas he obviously was. But the speerin night, once that had concluded, you could then produce your bottle of whiskey and your loaf of bread. And the next thing was the booking night. Now, the booking night was done by the bridegroom and the best man, or the groomsman, as he was known, who was usually a close relative, male relative of the bride. So like a brother, I guess, and such like. And he would go down either to the minister or to the session clerk, depending on who did it. And you expressed your intention to marry, and they would enter it into the session clerk book. So your name would be written, and so hence booking night. And then a fee would be paid. And the banns would be read at the kirk on 3 consecutive Sundays. Now that is when the intention of the couple to be married was made public to the congregation. And for reading it on the 3 Sundays was a shilling. And reading it on 2 Sundays, because you could shorten this if you could pay for it. So doing it on 2 Sundays was 10 shillings. But to do the 3 readings of the banns on 1 day cost you £1.
Wow.
That's a lot of money in those days. I mean, people, they could work for a year and mark a couple of quid.
So why would anyone be in that big of a hurry? Because it's only 3 weeks.
Well, there was a story about one of the Dons in Westray. Now, the Dons, as you may or may not know, get their name from the fact that they were meant to be survivors of the Spanish Armada. There's a lot of Armada wreck stories around Orkney. And a ship that gaed down, supposedly off in North Ronaldsay, like on the sheep dyke, not the sheep dyke, what am I speaking about? The reef dyke. Gosh, sheep's dyke's very different. The reef dyke is
not usually dangerous to passing ships either.
The reef dyke is a long reef that lies to the it's on the southeast side of the island, and has claimed many a ship. Now, it foundered there, and then they had took a boat, and they had headed off. And the kind of tide had swept them along, and they ended up landing at Pierwell in Westray. And they married the local people there. And they were just known as the Dons, which Don is just lord in Spanish. So maybe there was a Don and being referred to as Don so-and-so. But anyway, the name stuck, and they were known as the Dons. They had made a pact among themselves to marry local women. But then they were, their offspring was only to marry among other Don families, which sounds dodgy to me because that's a very small gene pool. But anyway, that was the agreement. You didn't marry outside the family. Now, this guy had fallen in love with a Westray lass who wasn't one of the Dons. And he had paid the minister to read the banns 3 times on Sunday and then marry them immediately afterwards so that the Dons couldn't raise any objections to this. So the banns were read 3 times, the couple were married, and then they set off back to the house where they were staying, whether it was with her parents or his parents or did they have a place of their own? The story doesn't tell, but they were back at their own place anyway. And in the middle of the night, the Dons burst in and grabbed the man and dragged him from his bed and from the arms of his new wife. And they savagely beat him for breaking this bond, this sworn oath that they would only marry within their own kind. And the man crawled back to his bed, kind of more dead than alive, and lay there for a day or 2 before dying from his injuries. So, you don't mess with the Dons. You'll find a sheep's head in your bed if you don't want to. Or a selkie's head in your bed or something like that. Anyway, on the booking night, it was usually the relatives would get together at the bride's house, and there would be a feast. So there would be a celebration while the groom groom-to-be and groomsman were out doing the business, paying over the money and having the names entered into the session clerk's books. And, of course, the date of the wedding was set and all that. And the dates of weddings was kind of, it depended on what you wanted, really, because it was believed that Tuesdays, Thursdays and Sundays were lucky days to be married on. The tradition always was, when I was young, that it was a Friday. You always got married on a Friday night. And it's changing a bit now that a lot of it's on Saturdays. But, I mean, that's just modern kind of convention. Mm-hmm. But normally it was on the Friday, and then the Friday night was a big holy, and then you had plenty of scope for another big holy the next day. If you usually in the Isles, weddings went on for a couple of days with, and probably still do, actually. For success to the marriage and for good luck and fortune, then you had to be married with a growing moon and a flowing tide. There was no point in getting married with a waning moon. So the moon had to be growing. And if you married when it was waning, when the moon was getting smaller again, then that meant that you would never thrive, you would never prosper. Mm. And the tide as well had to be flowing rather than ebbing, because again, it's just your fortunes are ebbing away, so it's a symbolic thing, but that's what they always did. Now, guests to a wedding were invited in person, and usually it was the groom that would go around and with the best man, the groomsman, and they would visit all the houses in the parish or island, the people that they were inviting anyway. And this was usually done on foot, so they would walk from place to place. Now, everywhere they gaed and did the invite, there was no invitation. There was no card or nothing. You were just told by word of mouth, you're invited to the wedding. It's going to be on this day. And you were always given a dram when you went in there, a good big old tumbler of whiskey. So by the end of the day, as they were going around all these houses, sometimes they were actually got so drunk that they had to abandon it and go home. and then finish it off the next day.
Day 2 of the invitations.
Where again, more drams would be administered. But it was just the custom of the time, and it's still something that you do.
It's about
give
celebration.
You give folk a dram if they visit, if they are inclined to dramming. But now, either on the eve of the wedding or sometime before it was another strange ceremony called the foot washing. And that was just as you would kind of imagine. The bride would be sat down on a stool, and the father would take off her rivlins, or her shoes. Her mother would take off her stockings, and then she would hold her daughter's feet up into the air, sometimes so much that she would overbalance on the stool and sometimes fall off, which was regarded as a bit of a laugh, because all the bride's female friends were there. And then the mother would turn her daughter's feet with the course of the sun. Everything was done with the course of the sun, so like clockwise direction. Really bad luck to do anything against the sun, widdershins. So her feet was turned and then brought down with a splash into a large tub of water. And then the bride's female pals would set to scrubbing her feet. So her feet was washed, ready for the wedding the next day. And the mother would also, when she splashed her daughter's feet into the water, would drop a ring in it as well. And the bride would try her best to conceal the ring under her foot. And, of course, all the girls were looking for the ring because the belief was that the first one to find the ring was the next to be married.
Right.
So they were all after that ring.
Oh, that would tickle all those fingers scrabbling around under your feet.
I don't think it was so much tickling. I think it was a bit more robust than that. I think it would probably be quite a painful experience. Now, with the men, they also had a foot washing as well, but their pals were a bit more boisterous than that, and so the foot scrubbing was pretty brutal. There was occasions when both bride and groom had the foot washing at the same time, in the same tub of water.
Oh.
Now, the water couldn't just be disposed of any old way. What they used to do, which might seem a bit unpleasant to you, but they would keep the water that their feet was washed in until the next day and then wash her hair with it. But then if it was disposed of, an old woman, usually the kind of oldest in the household, a grandmother or whatever, would have to go outside and dig a hole and pour the water in that and then replace the turfs on it, maybe muttering a charm over it as she did so. But it's kind of reminiscent of the trying to stop any evil person, any witch or sorcerer, from obtaining any part of you, like a fingernail cutting or a hair, which then they could use to cast a spell on you, which could be fatal. The more intimate the object, the more powerful the curse could be. And the one thing that you had to be very careful of, though this is an Orkney thing, but the one thing that they had to be careful of was your poop, your stools. And that is why there is still, I believe, a royal appointment called the groomsman of the king's stool. And it was a position at court that was jealously guarded and much, much wanted, because this keeper of the king's stool was responsible for being with the monarch at their most kind of private moment, but also it was their responsibility to make sure that this was disposed of in such a way that no evil person could obtain any part of it, because with that having been through the inside of you, that was as intimate as you could get.
Mm-hmm.
And therefore the curse that could be laid on you using a part of that would be extremely powerful. And but the reason that everybody wanted that job was because you got to spend time alone with the king, and then you could use your influence over him to benefit yourself, your family, and your friends.
People were bribing you to get the king's ear.
Yeah. So, and you could also say, you know, that so-and-so, I wouldn't trust him if I was you, you know, and make up some stories about your rivals, people you had a grudge against. So this was, but yeah, things like fingernail cuttings and such like had to be burnt, had to be destroyed so that you didn't end up having it used as a curse against you.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the one tradition about the foot washing, though, before it happened, is that it was recorded in one version by Geordie Marwick that the tub that was used for the foot washing had to be set outside, facing the sun for 12 hours, so that the sun shone on it for 12 hours. And it was considered to be extremely unlucky if a dog looked into the tub.
Oh.
So you kept your dog tied up and kept an eye out for any passing car that might come along and go, "What's that?" and stick their nose in the tub. I had no idea. But then dogs are considered bad luck in other circumstances, as we'll get to in the death one.
Mm.
But in his version as well, what they used was half fresh water and half seawater as well in foot washing. Now, there was a story from Knowlton Castle in Westray of the Balfour family that owned it was having a wedding. And the young bride was, like washing your feet in common water was really not good enough for her, for someone of her status. So they used red wine instead, and her feet was washed in wine.
La-di-da.
So you go around with clarity-smelling feet. Now, the old housekeeper had asked what had happened to the wine, and people were kind of reticent about telling her, but it eventually came out that some of the servants had drank it after the foot washing in it. And she was complaining bitterly to the lady of the house that the servants had drunk this wine. They protested that they didn't drink the wine for the love of the alcohol. They did it out of love for their lady. A likely bloody story, I would say. But anyway, the old woman of the house said, "But why did you want that? You know, I mean, it's no use. You couldn't serve that to anybody. Doesn't matter." And she says, I can, but I was wanting to take it out to pour on the how where the hogbun bides. So the family hogbun was in a mound outside, and that was going to be his share from the wedding, was the wine. So, but poor old hogbun didn't get anything.
Well, maybe they got him some fresh wine instead of the foot wine.
No, I don't think so. He might have got a drop of ale, though. If you know what
Keep your hogbun happy.
It pays to keep your hogbun happy, because they can turn nasty on you if you ignore them, as a couple in Sandy found to their cost at Hellyhow. when they neglected to feed their hogbun. A hogbun was a spirit that lived in a mound, kind of like a trow, but not the same variety at all. They were the guardian spirits of the farm, and they would bring luck and fertility to the farm as long as you shared the produce of the farm with them. If you didn't, then they would make your life hell, which is what happened to the couple at Helihow. They discovered that there was things going missing and such like because they had stopped feeding the hogbun. They thought it was an old superstition, and so it didn't happen. And Hogbun was sitting in his mound waiting for his offerings to come, because he always shared whatever it was that you had. You know, you could put a bit of meal on the mound, or you could pour milk on it, or home-brewed ale when you were making that. A bit of butter, a bit of cheese. The produce of the farm was shared with the Hogbun. And then that ensured prosperity and fertility on the farm. So the Hogbun's sitting there waiting for his supper to arrive, and it never came. And he thought, well, maybe they're ill. So he was concerned. So he went down to the house late at night when they were asleep and peeped in around the door and went in, but there they were, all lying, snoring away in bed, perfectly healthy. So he went over to the porridge pot to get a scraping of porridge off the side of it, and discovered to his horror that the woman of the house had scrubbed the pot clean, and there was nothing stuck to the side of it. And so he was furious, and that's when he started stealing things from them and just creating practical chokes on them and making their life hell. Eventually the man had to go to the laird and say, I don't suppose you've got another croft that we could rent. He said, well, there is one that's just come available on the other side of the island. So the guy goes, I'll take it. So they set off with what goods they had left that the Hogbun hadn't stolen. And they borrowed ponies from the neighbours, and they had clibbers on them. It's a wooden pack saddle that you had panniers called maces made out of woven straw that hooked over it. So it was just like a big long mat with a handle on either end, like a shopping bag kind of handle. So you hooked that to the horn of the clibber, the wooden piece of that horn that stuck up. You hooked it over that, and then you filled it with goods, and then you hooked the other handle over it, and it just held it there. So they set off with that anyway, and the further they got from Helihow, the happier they got. And the sun was shining, the larks were singing, the man was feeling very happy. And in the first pannier on the lead pony, there was the kern, the butter churn. So they were in sight of their new house, and the man is congratulating himself on the fact that they got rid of the Hogbun and that life is now going to be good. When suddenly the lid of the cairn flew open, and the Hogbun stuck his head out and said, we're getting a grand day for flitting, good man. Because what he'd forgotten is that Hogbuns don't just go with the house, they go with the family. So he'd followed them. So I hope that they fed him after that.
They learned their lesson.
Yeah. I should say that Helihow, it's still a croft in Burness and Sandy. Abandoned now though, but the name Helihow comes from Holy Mound. And there would have been a large mound there, but there isn't a mound there anymore. But I think that may have gone to coastal erosion. But there's no mound there now. And to have a place name like that would be very specific, the fact that there was a mound there. And then for some reason, it was regarded as holy, though. Why, I have no idea. But it was just up the road for where me feather came for at Netherbracken in Sandy. Anyway, enough of all of that, because Hogbuns, that's a bit of an aside, I suppose. So your feet's been washed, and your hair has been washed with the water, and then the water has been carefully disposed of into a hole. And the following day, then, on the day of the wedding, usually about 10 o'clock in the morning, the the groom would turn up at the house of the bride, and then there would be the wedding walk to the kirk, which was led by the groom, and he was arm in arm with the best maid, so like the bridesmaid. And then came the bride, who was linked arms with the groomsman, so the best man. And then behind them there was their friends. Now, the friends probably had girlfriends, so they would link arms with them. But then as the young women came out of the house, the unmarried women, they would be grabbed by the man that fancied them. And if there was more than one, there would be the sort of tug-of-war going on with this poor lass in between being pulled in half until the one managed to get hold of her.
With much hilarity.
And then that was regarded as you were then a pair for that day. And you headed off then to the kirk, long walk to the kirk. And the person, all the young people were at the end, and the single men and all that were at the back, and the bairns. And whoever was at the back was called the tail sweeper. And they had to drag a heather besom, so like a brush made out of heather. Not necessarily had to be made out of heather, but that's normally what they were here. So they were just a big clump of heather tied onto a piece of wood. So it was just a broomstick. And that had to be dragged behind the tail sweeper to sweep away the traces of their footsteps, to conceal it from the trows. They were led by a piper or a fiddler who would play all the way there. And there would be somebody with an old muzzle-loading shotgun, with the gunpowder and all that, would fire guns over them all the way to the kirk to frighten away the trows. The pity folk would be frightened off. So it was safety to them.
They had to be very careful of those trows.
What are you doing?
What about the old people? Did they not? Is this procession just for the young people?
Well, I think that they probably were at the back as well. I mean, I can't imagine that they wouldn't go, Though not all the old folk went, as we will find out in a bit. Another thing that was considered very good luck was that you had to cross running water at least twice during the wedding walk. Now, again, bear in mind, like I said last time, a hoose could be miles for the kirk, so it could be a very long way. But they would walk along there anyway, and if they saw a rival wedding on a wedding walk too, maybe heading to the same kirk, then they would race them. They would start getting faster and faster to try to be the first to get there, because it was believed that the first one got the more blessing. You would prosper
the
better.
Fresh blessings,
yeah. And another thing that was bad luck was to see a funeral procession on your way. That did not bode well for the future. Now, if you were marrying a girl from a different parish, which, like I said last time, was kind of unusual, because you generally tended to marry from near to where you came from. But if you lived near a boundary of a parish, then you married a girl from a different parish, you would be assailed by boys who would demand a football. And it was up to the groomsman, to the best man, to provide a football for them, which was just an inflated pig's bladder. And that would be thrown to them, and then that would placate them. If you didn't have a ball, then you had to throw bacillar, so ball silver, money,
Oh.
in lieu of a ball.
Oh.
And they would gather it up. It's a bit like a scramble for pennies that they used to have in Scottish cities, you know, when people got married. They would scatter coins on the street, you know, just pennies and all.
Never heard of that.
And the bairns would all be dived on it like white ma's, you know, and round the tip they'd be on it trying to grab as many of the pennies as they could get for themselves. But it was just called a scramble for pennies. But if the groomsman was a tight arse who decided that he didn't want to give either a football or money, then there was trouble. Because the boys would make sure that your wedding walk was a nightmare. You know, they would throw clumps of turf at you. And in one case, in Sandy, they got a lot of dried tangles. So, you know, dried kelp stems, which dry to be like a kind of, like a bullwhip bunny, probably drier and stronger, you know. And they set on them with this, beating away at people.
Jeez.
One woman had her legs.
Crowd here.
One woman had her leg cut so badly in Sandy that she couldn't carry on with the wedding. She had to go home. Some of the men then also armed themselves with tangles and started thrashing the boys. So there was a battle between the boys and all that.
Seems like it'd be easier just to give them a ball.
It would have been a lot easier to either give them a ball or just chuck some money at them, you know. But there you go. Obviously, a tight one. No.
Can I ask you a question?
Yeah, of course.
It seems like an appropriate spot for it. We now have a custom called blackening, or is it blacking? It's blackening.
Blackenings, yeah.
But that's not a traditional Orkney thing, is it?
No, it's a much more recent thing than that. But yeah, that is a custom that I didn't have down here because this is sort of like old customs. And I was thinking
and just because I think people might be wondering if they visited here and been shocked to see such goings on, and then we're told what it was. But it's actually quite a new custom that came from Sooth.
Yeah, it kind of originated. Well, I think it came to Orkney from like Aberdeen or Aberdeenshire. So east coast of Scotland, but it certainly used to happen down there, and no doubt still does. But it would have come up here maybe in the 60s. I know it was certainly on the go in the early 70s. And that is when the groom, the man, you know, the husband to be, would get grabbed by his pals. And then, well, these days they're sort of covered with a mixture of treacle and flour and eggs. You know, treacle is molasses, as you say in America. So you were black, and you got that poured over your head. You were blackened. Back in the early 70s, I remember they were not quite so gentle because they would use spent oil, which would be a nightmare to try to get off. And also, I mean, if that went in your eyes, I mean, that would really hurt. You know, that's not nice. But anyway, I guess they were more hardcore in those days. And it couldn't have been that old a tradition because here people couldn't afford. And of course, after the war, there was rationing up until the 1950s on certain things. I think rationing ended about 1956 or something, but again, that was just on certain materials. But if they had flour and treacle and eggs, they'd make a bloody cake with it, or they make a bunno, a treacly bunno. You never see them anymore. My mother used to make treacly bunnos, but you never see it. A bannock made with butter, with molasses, with treacle. Yeah,
sounds good.
They were really nice. I mean, they weren't like uber treacly, but it was a lovely taste.
Was it sweet?
Butter, and it was a bit sweet, yeah. And And you'd have that with butter or a bit of jam. So, usually rhubarb, as they say. We call it rhubarb. And rhubarb jam could be made with either just on its own or with cloves in it, was usually the way that it was made by the old folk. That's what my mother used to do anyway. But back to blackenings. These days, it's not just the men anymore, it's the women and as well are involved for that. And so you get covered with this stuff, and then you're bundled on a chair in the back of a pickup, and you go round and round and round the tune, shouting, blowing whistles, and banging on oil drums or on the side of the pickup with sticks. So there's this bang, 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 and whistles going off, comes up the street. And all kind of good-natured banter. And these days, there's a new kind of thing evolved around that, where they've got industrial cling film these days. What do you call it in America?
Plastic wrap.
Yeah. Well, this is the industrial stuff that you would use for wrapping up pallets, rather than just the small roll that you get in your kitchen. And they would then Velcro you to the market cross in front of the cathedral. So you're at the market cross, wrapped to that, covered with cling film. And then they would go off and leave you there and drive around the thing. And the person would then try to escape and get away. But I was once phoned at the museum by a community police officer, and he wanted to know what the origin of blackening was, and whether it was like the bar, an ancient tradition. And I said, no, it's no ancient. It's, it's within living memory here. But, it's about fun and people enjoy it. And I mean, when I was young, you got blackened, you then immediately went to the pub. And I remember pubs just being like having big treacly handprints like in the bathroom and stuff like that, in the toilet. But then the pub owners got a bit kind of, and the staff.
Understandably annoyed.
Got a bit pissed off about this. So it's now insisted that you have to have a wash before you can come into the pub after that.
They seem to carry liquid refreshment around with them as they're going around banging and screaming.
There's always tins on the go. And so, yep. But the reason that the police was in touch was because they were wanting to issue some safety warnings around it. And they were very sensitive of the fact that they didn't want people to think that they were trying to be killjoys or stop this or prevent it in any way. But they were just issuing some, basically common sense guidelines so that nobody got hurt. Because sadly, it has happened in the past when somebody was killed, actually. So it's, just falling out of the back of the van on the chair, because they used to tie people to the chair. And then if they sort of set off at speed and, so it was tragic, but they're just wanting to kind of make sure that it's fun and it's safe and that everybody comes out of it happy and in one piece. But they were very, very cautious about not wanting to be seen to be stopping it or, trying to control it or regulate it and all, but just offering advice as to keeping safe, So they phoned me to ask what the origins were, and so I, just said what I've just said to you. So, there it was.
Yes. Well, thank you for answering that, because I do think that people would be wondering about it, because it does seem like something that would be, it's just kind of nutty enough to be an old custom.
Yeah. There was once when I was working in the museum shop and I was assistant custodian there, there was a bemused tourists came in one Saturday afternoon when there was a blackening going around. And unfortunately, with the timing, there was a funeral on in the cathedral at the same time as they were driving around hooting and bashing away on cans and such like. And the tourists came in and said, why is there people all covered with, with black stuff and banging things and blowing whistles? Is that part of the funeral thing? Are they driving away evil spirits? And I thought, oh, hang on while I just put this bone through my nose, and so, well, that's not stereotyping anybody, is it? So I said, no, it's just there happens to be a wedding they'll be getting married next weekend, and so that's just a bit of a hoolie. But I said it's unfortunate timing that there happens to be a funeral on at the same time, because I think people wouldn't. Yeah, no, I don't think people would be.
It's almost nice to be reminded that life goes on and celebrations.
Yeah. The worst I heard was a guy in Bursey. His pals grabbed him on the day of the wedding, because he usually got married in the evening. And, just sort of tea time, sort of 7 o'clock or 6:30 or something like that. And they grabbed this guy and stripped him off and rubbed him all over with black boot polish. Oh. And, of course, he was getting married that evening. He couldn't get it off.
Oh, poor guy.
So he scrubbed and he scrubbed and he scrubbed his face and neck and hands till he got them kind of pink or probably red. And then went to the wedding. But they said, they started going, what's that smell? And he just reeked of boot polish because he was still covered with the stuff. And then it started seeping through to his shirt. So he had a white shirt on, which was going black with the boot polish. But the worst I heard of Westray and Orkney, it was in Murrayshire. And my former father-in-law told me about this guy that he knew that got grabbed by his pals on the day of the wedding, and they painted his legs green with gloss paint.
Oh.
And I said, what the hell did they paint his legs for? And he said, because he was wearing a kilt. Oh, of course.
That's terrible.
Oh, that's rough. That's rough. Anyway, so you've avoided rival weddings and any funerals, and you have pitched up at either the kirk or the manse, because sometimes they got married in the manse, the official residence of the minister, his home. And they would get married in there. And who was the first person to kiss the bride?
The minister.
Mm-hmm. You were supposed to say the groom, of course.
Oh, sorry, I thought it was a test. I got this one.
I've taught you too well, young one. Yeah, the minister got the first kiss, not the husband. And then they would set off. Once they left the building, it was kind of noticed what airt, as we say, what direction the wind was blowing from. Because if the wind was blowing in the married couple's face, it boded ill for them. Because it meant that they would always have a struggle in life. So that was watched for. And then you left and went home. The walk went back home again, this time with the newly married bride and groom leading the way arm in arm. And the piper or the fiddler would play as you walked home. And when they got back to the bride's house, they were met by an old couple who had been appointed with special duties that day. The old man was usually could be a member of the family, could be just a well-respected old man in the community, and he was called the Mesterhusel, so like master of the household. And he had to offer you a cog of ale, so you got a drink when you got back.
Can you tell what a cog is?
A cog is a wooden bucket that is still used at weddings. It's got staves a different colour. We were getting on to this, by the way, later on.
Oh, sorry.
No,
I didn't want to miss it. It's
doesn't
important.
matter. It's got staves, so it's made like a little straight-sided barrel, wider at the top than the bottom. And then it's alternate colours of wood, so it's sort of dark and light. And then either you have a horn cog, which has got two of the staves then is carved into round handles. A lot of the old cogs had 3 horns on them, so that you were holding the cog when you passed it to the next person. So you always had 3 hands on it, to make sure it didn't get dropped. Mm-hmm. And you were holding it properly. There's also lugged cogs as well, which have got handles on the side like a mug. And so we'll speak more about cogs later on. But anyway, they got their cog. And there was also a wecht, which we mentioned last time, that big round, shallow utensil like a boran, with a hoop of wood covered with sheepskin. And that was used for winnowing and such like, and sifting meal with, sifting flour. But on this occasion, it was used as a serving dish. And there would be bannocks in that, or maybe butter or a bit of cheese. So people would get a drink and a bite to eat when you got back. And there was an old woman there as well, called the Hansel wife. Now, Hansel is a term for like a small gift. It could be money, it could be just a small gift. Now, the Hansel wife was always chosen from within the community as being one of the oldest women in the community, but with a reputation for being open-handed, generous. So you wouldn't have a niggardly person now. You wouldn't have somebody that would begrudge you a bite to eat as a Hansel wife. There was somebody who was known to be generous. And she was holding the youngest bairn in the parish, and that was known as the Hansel bairn. So a baby, maybe a few months old. Well, ideally, obviously, it's kind of difficult, whatever was available. But the Hansel wife would pass the Hansel bairn to the bride. And then it was watched very closely, because depending on what leg the bairn lifted first, meant that it would showed what the woman would have, mostly boys or girls. So if it lifted its left leg first, that meant that the woman would have mostly boys, and if it lifted its right leg first, then that meant mostly girls. Huh. What happened if they lift both legs at once, I don't know. Doesn't actually half and half, I suppose. After that, the Hansel wife would come out with the wedding cake. Now, we would think of wedding cakes as being like a fruit sponge, maybe with, well, not sponge, but just like a heavy fruit cake. And here you'd have marzipan on it and icing. So that is what we think of as a wedding cake, usually in several tiers. It was always traditional to keep the one of the tiers, like the middle tier, for the christening. But this has got nothing to do with this tradition. It's long, long before wedding cake, as we know it. So it's not like a wedding cake like we would think of these days. It was made with oatmeal or bear meal, depending on what you had. Lots of butter and caraway seeds, carvey as we called it. So it's like a fennel, I think.
Oh, similar, yeah.
Yeah. But caraway seeds anyway, they were called carvey when I was petty. And you'd have biscuits with carvey in it, and I used to like them. Hard biscuits.
But were they sweet or were they...
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
So this was sweetened. So basically it was like shortbread, but maybe made with bear, with barley.
Okay.
And sometimes there would be a feint that an old woman would come out holding her apron and pulling ridiculous faces, and then everybody thought that she had the cake crumbled up and would throw it down, and then everybody had to scramble for a piece of it. But then she would get outside and she would cast her apron up, and there was nothing in it. And then the Hansel wife would sneak out and would hold the bride's cake, the wedding cake, above the bride's head and on the flat of her hand, and then bring her other hand, which was clenched as a fist, down on top of the cake and smash it, and then it would fall over the bride. And among kind of posher people, they would put a cloth over the bride's head, but not necessarily everyone. And then there was a big scramble to get hold of a piece of the cake, because it was believed that the bigger piece you could manage to secure, if you put it under your pillow at night, you would dream of the person that you were going to marry. But it also contained a ring and also a button. And if you found... Baked in it, yeah. So if you found the ring, it meant that you would be married soon after. If you found the button, it meant that you were doomed to be a bachelor if it was a man.
Oh, no.
So you wouldn't marry. So that was the big pieces were much in demand. Now, there would be a big feast as well held in the house, and what they would do is they would clear out the house. And they would have maybe 2 tables set up against either wall. So there would be a row of benches, which could just be like kists, like chests, lined up, and maybe a couple of kists and a couple of planks of wood over it would serve as a bench. And the same on the other side, and then that repeated on the other long wall. And along the top, on a shorter piece, there would be the bride and groom would sit there. And people were divided up into little groups of 6. And they would have a trencher put in front of them, which is a wooden trough, as we would say, put in front of them with boiled chicken and lamb, mutton in it. And you would then cut pieces for yourself, and you would be paired up, of course, from that day with a woman if you weren't married. So you would give you would cut a slice of meat as well for your woman of the day. And that was kind of, there was no plates, but you would get a bannock, and you would have that cut up. For anybody who doesn't know what a bannock or a bunno, as I was brought up calling it, bunnos are flatbread. So it's made on a griddle over the fire. Unleavened bread, big round thing, flat things, about an inch or so thick. And that was used as a plate. So you would cut a bit of meat and you would put it on the bannock and you'd eat that. You'd also share in an ale cog. So you'd have a smaller cog than you would have for like a bride's cog. And that was circulated among that group as well. There is a couple of really nice examples of those ale cogs in the Orkney Museum. If you go up into the Merchant Laird's Gallery, there's a couple of cogs there which would have been imported from Norway originally. And the term cog is the same as keg. It's the same origin. And when I was piddy, if you were short and fat, then you were a cag. And that would refer to an animal as well as a person. Okay. People didn't like being called a cag.
I wouldn't think so.
But it meant a barrel.
Right.
So anyway, they would feast there. And because these are old longhouses, so there would be a room next to that as well where food was being prepared. And the food actually came mostly from the bride's family, but also the groom's family as well, and also local people. Because remember, these people had little. Mm-hmm. And so for a while before, people were brewing ale for the wedding. And they would also boil a chicken. And I mean, if you're thinking of supermarket chickens, great, huge, wide breasts and stuff, these were scrawny things with a breast and like a keel, so that they're like pointed, very little meat on them. But then if you boiled up plenty of them, and it was usually like cocky chicken, so it was young roosters, which they didn't want, because then all they would do is fight, and then fight over the hens and such like. So they were of no use to you. So they tended to end up in the pot early when they were still young. And of course, any, sheep would be slaughtered for it, and they would be boiled up. And so all this meat would have been taken up and then served up. And there was soup as well, usually started the feast. So they would make pots of soup. And there would be a dish of soup put in front of you, and everybody would have a horn spoon. And then you all fell to and you all supped the soup out the same dish. The six of you would all do justice to the soup. And then there would be the barn would have been cleaned out and swept. And that is where the dancing took place. So all the people retired there. And the old folk used to do like kind of ridiculous old dances. They would ham it up. They would be showing how ancient and decrepit they were, and they would sort of lift a leg and they would shuffle around, and much to the hilarity of the younger people, and they would go through this motion of pretending to dance, start the dancing. And then once they had finished doing that, the fiddler would strike up and the dancing would start properly then. So lots of the old traditional dances would have been done. And the old folk would then retire back into the house again, where they would again sit around the tables and drink and tell stories, and also hear mead rhymes, as they called them, which were great long ballads. And that is where Denison had a couple of them saved. The one was The Voyage of Lady Sarah, which is a story about a young woman who lives in a city in Scotland, falls in love with this young man, runs away with him, not realizing that he is a rover. He's a bit of a dodgy character. And they sail off in his ship, and they come up as far as the island of Stronsay. And Scotta Bess is the witch, is sitting in the mermaid's chair, and she summons fog. And because Skoda in Old Norse meant fog, she was Foggy Bess, Foggy Elizabeth. Met a horrible end in the early 1600s when she was grabbed by a lot of the local men who took her to the barn at the farm of Hupe and beat her to death with flails, which they believed had been sanctified because it had been washed in holy water. But it was actually just the water that the chalice used at the communion had been washed in. And then her body was taken out and buried dumped in a loch. And in the morning, no, she was buried. Sorry, I'm getting that wrong. She was buried. And in the morning, her body was back up on the top of the earth again. And they buried her, and the next day she was back up. So they took her out into the loch and they sunk her down there with sort of stones attached to her. And then they carted out stones and earth and poured over the spot where she was until it ended up creating a small island, a wee home in the middle of the loch. So that was the story of Scotta Bess. One that you don't find in the witch trial thing because she was murdered. Now, in the story, she summons up a fog or a storm, but she also conjures up a phantom ship, and their ship follows it, thinking that it's safe. Well, if that ship's going there, it must be fine. And of course, she leads them onto the rocks. And then there's a bit about the, her father's spirit comes up to her in a boat and says that they're doomed because they have fled and blah, blah, blah.
And this is one of those old...
These are one of these made-up ballads, this here-made rhymes, which was recited at these weddings. And so she ends up dying in the shipwreck and is buried on Sandy, a place now known as the Nauza Yarrow. And it was supposed to be the bodies of the people from the shipwreck that are in the barrows. They're actually Bronze Age, but, it's just a legend, it's a story. The other one, which was a here-made rhyme, which was recited at these events as well, was the play of the Lady Odivere. So a Selkie story, where the Lady Odivere is forced isn't the right word, because she wasn't forced, but it was enchantment from the Odivere swearing the Odin oath that meant she had to marry him, even though there was no love there. And then he abandons her to go off on a crusade, and a knight turns up who turns out to be a Selkie man who was her former lover. And she gets pregnant by him and has a baby who then he comes and takes from her to be his heir. He lives on Sulskerry, which is a small uninhabited island with a lighthouse on it, now about 36 miles west of here, where we are in Stromness. And she says, how will she know her child from the other Selkies? And he says that its coat will be as white as snow, but its paws will be black. And paws and head, I think, was black. So she put a gold chain around her neck that she'd been given from Odivere. And when Odivere comes back, he gets bored after a short time, so they go off hunting otters. And a young seal swims out the bay, and he kills it and finds it and has a gold chain around its neck, brings it back to his wife and says, read me this riddle. And she curses him. And he knows that she's been unfaithful to him. And of course, he was never unfaithful to her when he was out in all the brothels in Constantinople, Istanbul now, having a carousing and having a whale of a time. Now, She used to be executed, and but the Selkie saves her by driving whales into the bay, and they all go and try to catch the whales and drive them ashore, but they never get any of them. And when they come back, the door of the tower that she's held in has been forced off its hinges, kicked off, lying on the floor, and she's gone. And after that, Odevier can't find any friends because he swore the Odin oath. You get what you wish for in the beginning, but it never ends well, because Odin is a fickle god and a fickle friend to have. So he's got plenty of everything, but he's got nobody that's willing to drink with him. So anyway, that was...
And his wife has run off to Selkie.
Yeah.
Hey friends, I just want to tell you how much Tom and I appreciate your spending this time with us. If you've just discovered our podcast, you might not realize that we have a website too. Whether you're interested in Orkney history, folklore, storytelling, or everyday life, you'll find it on Orkneyology.com. We're also publishing some really unusual books now through our Orkneyology press. If you'd like to encourage us in our work of preserving the wisdom and heritage of older times, buying our books direct from our online shop is a great way to do that, as is sharing our podcast and our website with people who might be interested. And if you'd like to buy us a coffee or a dram, we do have a page on Ko-fi, which is spelled Ko-fi. Just look for Orkneyology. Thanks again. Enjoy.
When the young folk had grown tired of the dancing, everybody retired through, again back to the house, where the food was still piled up, there was still plenty more to eat. And they would finish off again, feasting there and having a drink. And during that time, the Mr. Hussel, the old man, would go through this a ceremony of marrying the young people. So he would grab, all the lasses were placed around on seats, and a young man would be grabbed and kind of forcibly dragged into the room, and then the old man would decide who he was going to marry him off to, and would drag him over and dump him on the knee of the lass of his choice. And then they were considered to be sort of like a pair after that. But some of this, of course, was done in cahoots with the young men who had expressed their preference of who they wanted to be put with. But they did say that actually some marriages came out of that as well, but who knows? Now, there was folk came in and did singing and dancing. I mean, in Shetland they had skecklers coming in who were like mummers in England, so they would be dressed up in fancy dress and they would sing songs or perform a little play. And so similar things may have happened in Orkney as well. There might have been people coming in singing certain pieces or doing certain little plays as part of the wedding. Now, as the wedding was going on, if all's folk been paired off, you're still drinking, there was the menye cogs were teenut. And there was the good man's cog, the minister's cog, and the bride's cog. And they differed for the ale cogs, which were all the same colour, because they had the alternate staves of different colours. And the last one to come out was the bride's cog. And that was basically designed to finish off anyone that was still standing. Because if you weren't on the floor by that time, then it was regarded as a poor wedding if you went home still able to walk. And the bride's cog was a mixture of hot spiced ale, sweetened, and with spirits added, whiskey or gin, usually. And in those days, it was thickened with a beaten egg. I think maybe egg white was added to it and beaten into it. which, doesn't sound that
Might be
good.
a little bit like eggnog kind of thing.
I don't know, but it's also, just to kind of add a bit of an extra layer of weirdness on it, they would put pancakes in it. And there would be a ladle in it, so you could drink with the cog, because the bride was the first to drink with it, and then it was passed around to everybody. And you could hook up a bit of this pancake with a ladle and eat it as well. Sometimes it was prone to practical chokers, because there was one old man in Sandy chewed and chewed and chewed for ages on one of those pancakes and could mark nothing of it, and declared it was the chuckest thing he'd ever set between his yackles. So it was the toughest thing that he'd ever had between his molar teeth. And he threw it on the floor in disgust. And everybody laughed, because, of course, they could see then that it was actually a woolen mitten that somebody had dropped in, that the old guy was trying to scoff. Now, occasionally you got cogs that were a bit more genteel, because one of the horns would be hollow, and the bottom of it would be under the level of the drink. And that was called the Chentry's cog. And they could use that as a straw to suck up the liquor rather than drinking it out of the cog. Huh. Sometimes they would have a false bottom on the cog as well, and they would put something in it, like a marble or some coins or whatever, so that it would rattle when you picked it up. Even just a pebble would do, I suppose. But it sounded like there was something in the cog. And it has been said in the past, I don't know if it's right or not, that there was at least once a pair of false teeth had been introduced into a cog as well. Wouldn't exactly do you much good if you're drinking that and you've seen that smiling up at you. But that was the last drink of the night, was the bride's cog, and it was considered to be bad manners to ask for any more after that. There was still some things that you had to watch out for, though, just to be on the safe side. And the one of it was watching out for a witch who would walk around the house against the sun, carrying 2 dried fish, one in each hand, which means that when the woman, the bride, had her first baby, she would have no milk to nurse it with. It would dry her up. That was hence the dried fish. Another story for Gramsay, for the house of Ramrey, which is still there, is it's a strange one, because I haven't come across anything like it before. It's in Mermaid Bride, but the belief there was that the bride was at risk for being abducted by the Selkie folk until the sun had risen. A new dawn on the day after the night of the wedding, and a watch had to be kept very closely for a Selkie trying to get at the house and abduct the bride, so she had to stay in the house. And it was kind of tradition for the man to sit there with his arm around her and his hand upon her heart to make sure that she was safe. Now, on this occasion, there was a shout outside, because a great bull Selkie had come up the close of the house. It was a big, powerful beast, of course, with sharp teeth, but they got it rolled over and they slit its throat. And then they hung it on a great nail on the gable end of the house. And then they congratulated themselves that the Selkie had been defeated and that knew the bride was safe. And she started to relax more, and she was going out as well, and she was trying to make matches between her unmarried friends as well, do a bit of matchmaking, when suddenly there was a scream, and they ran out to see what was wrong. And the bride was gone, but in her place was left something they called a sea wife, which they said was a poor shulpid thing, so a poor bitter thing, kind of thin and frail and certainly not the bride. So it was almost like a changeling in a way, but for the Selkies. They ran round to the end of the house where the Selkie had been hanging, and his body was gone. So that was that. The dowry was withheld from the old guy because, from the groom, because the old man said, well, that's not my daughter. And with that kind of stoic kind of determination of, well, when life gives you oranges?
Lemons.
When life gives you lemons, make lemonade, He decided that he would just have to make the best of a bad thing, and he stayed with his sea wife anyway, and they had bairns. Oh. But he missed the young lass, Kitty Yorston was her name, who would have been his wife. So you have to be on the watch out for anything that's sort of bad luck. I've never heard a story like that before, but it was told on Gramsci and recorded by Geordie Marwick. And so it's a place that certainly exists. But I've never heard of Selkies. I've heard of Selkies seducing women, but I've never heard of them abducting ones.
Yeah,
and
it does seem like it's a little bit mixed up with the trowie tales, doesn't it?
So, if you've survived Selkie abductions and the Strongbos, the last dance of the night was called Bobbity Boaster, or the Reel of Barn. And folk got together. There was a young man would dance by himself, and then he would take a girl at the audience. The two of them would dance, and then they would choose another man who had to dance between them, and then they chose another girl, and she had to dance between them. They would hold hands around her, and they would go slowly around with the course of the sun, of course. And she would dance inside, and then she'd have to duck under their arms and go and get another man who then would have to dance in the circle while she linked hands with the other ones. And so it went on until everybody had taken part in the dance, and they went round and round with the course of the sun. And sometimes when like a young man was trying to duck out underneath the arms, they would try to smack him and trip him up and things like that. So it was all sort of, it was all good fun. But after that, everybody was ready for their bed, and there was a small room off the main room that had been made up for a bedroom for the young couple that night. And the bride was taken there by her female friends and was undressed and put into bed. And then the young men would take the young man there, and they would undress him rather roughly and then toss him into bed with the bride. But the women stayed there because there was a bit of an ongoing battle of the sexes going on, because the young men had to try to steal a piece of the bride's clothing and run off with it, and the women had to stop them from doing that. And there was a story of one young man that managed to get a stocking and ran with it, but one of the women, who was quite heavily built, got after him and managed to run him down and batter him. But they said that they had to run for about 1.5 miles before she got him. And then she went triumphantly back, brandishing the stocking. So it was, and we must...
Was it a Westray wifey? Because you always said don't mess with the Westray women.
On this occasion, no. You have to remember that stockings were we're not talking lingerie here. We're talking knitted stockings. And it was a custom for a bride to make wedding stockings for herself out of bog cotton. And we've got some some examples at the museum that were said to be made from bog cotton, but they were examined by somebody who was studying this, and they declared all of them to be, linen. Because bog cotton, Loki's Ow, as it was known, Loki, the god, trickster, and Ow is just the Orkney word for wool.
That would be really hard to weave with because it's
so short. Mm-hmm. And it's got seeds in it. There's a lot of problems there. But
that's the story anyway.
Well, that's the story, but the ones that's been looked at, but we have since then got another pair in there. Family tradition was that they were made by the bride from bog cotton. So the story must have originated somewhere, and maybe they did, but they said that they'd have to be really, really skilled. I think that was the whole point of it. You were showing how skilled you were, that you could make this very fine stockings, which were not exactly patterned, but I mean, they had little holes in them, but I mean, like deliberately. It was really, really lovely things. But that's the kind of stocking that we're talking about here. So they would have gone up to the knee or so. Now, the last thing that happened that night, on the night of the wedding, was carried out by the bride's mother and some of her elderly friends. And it was called the speerin of the snood. Now, snood is a ribbon. And I remember my mother, if something got knotted up, she would say, "Oh, it's in a snood." And, same word. But it was meant to be the ribbon that tied up a girl's hair, and it was a badge of virginity. It showed that you were an unmarried maiden, because your hair was tied up with this ribbon. On the morning of the wedding, the mother would untie the ribbon and comb the girl's hair out, and she would go out with her hair loose over her shoulder for the first time since childhood. And then the snood was kept by the mother, and then that night they placed a flat stone on the fire so that it heated up, and then they dropped the snood on the stone and they watched it. And depending on what shape it took as it started to, before it burned, but it started to shrivel up, then they could divine from that some way or other what kind of a life the girl could expect to have. But the thing was, this was something that only the women did. And when Walter Traill Denison in the 19th century tried to find out more about it, he was met with stony silence from the women, because it was something that a man had no business knowing. So it's
unfortunately, and for us,
it's never been passed down as to what it actually was, what the shapes that the snood took, what it meant. But I actually kind of like that, because it's kind of, we don't need to know everything.
That's right.
And also, it's a woman's thing.
Yeah, it's a mystery.
My gender has got no business dabbling in that.
That's right.
That was for the women to know and the men to wonder about. But after the wedding, there was the back feast was given by the best man and his friends. And this was to thank all the women who had done the cooking and the serving and such like. So they got treated. They got the chance to sit down, put their feet up, and have food dished up to them. Whether they had to cook in advance, I don't know.
Seems the thought that counts.
Seems men were regarded as quite useless in that sort of thing. But then, people, it was a very different society, and men were not expected to do anything like that.
But they did do other things.
Yeah. It reminded me of that thing in Father Ted, where he says to his woman, "Isn't it time you were getting home, because remember, you're husband tried to make the breakfast and burnt the house down. And you, Mrs. whatever it was, remember that time that your husband tried to make the bed and lost a leg? You know? So, the following Sunday, if you hadn't been married on a Sunday, the following Sunday was called Kirkin Sunday, and that was when the bride and groom went to the church the first time as a couple and were accepted by the minister into the congregation as a married couple. There was a woman was recorded as saying that she didn't feel like she'd been married until she'd been kirked. Then she knew that she'd properly married. When they got a new home for themselves, which maybe wasn't that common because you would tend to live with your parents or whatever, but if you were able to get a place to yourself, then there was the hame fair was given, so like a feast for the home, and that was for, again, family and friends would come there and have a feast in the new home. And then the last thing that the bride had to do with all his wedding things was to make 2 shrouds, one for herself and one for her husband, because death was never far away in those days, could always be lurking. People were lost at sea. People got kicked in the head by horses, you know. I mean, there was lots of things that could happen. And, of course, any disease coming along, there was nothing to take, you know, no antibiotics in those days. It reminds me of a story that I've never told before. So don't look for it on, or maybe, I don't think it's on Tales for Troubled Times. I'd be very surprised if it was.
So this is a podcast exclusive.
Well, it could be. I mean, unless my memory serves me wrong, but it's the story of Helen Waters and her wedding. Now, Helen Waters lived not that far from here on the other side of Brinky's Brae. She was, must have been Outertoun. Either Innertoun or Outertoun, just outside Stromness, but part of Stromness parish. And she lived in a wee house with her mum and dad. She was the only child. And it was just up above the banks of the beach. Now, there was a neighbour boy called Henry Graham who fell in love with her, courted her. I mean, they didn't know each other, I suppose, since they were bairns, but they were very happy to make a match. And she was very devoted to him, he was very devoted to her. And parents were happy. Wedding was arranged. Now, he had to go over to Hoy with some of his friends to go and visit a relative who must have been around the Monas area. And he went over there to invite them to the wedding. And then they decided to go hunting wildfowl in Rackwick. So they walked up the valley through towards Berrydale. And they were shooting there. And then they disappeared. Oh. Nobody knew what had happened to them. They'd just gone. And they, day or two later, people were getting worried. A boat was prepared. Went over to Hoy. Yeah, they'd been there. They'd done the wedding invitations. The last they'd heard was the sound of shooting between the hills. And that was as much as they could tell. So they thought that maybe they had gone over to Sulskerry to shoot gannets, which they would have then used for the wedding meal.
That's so far away.
It's about 36 miles on the Atlantic. And so you've got Sulskerry, which the name Sul comes from the Old Norse name for gannets, because while Sulskerry is actually riddled with puffin burrows, the Sul Stack, which is a short distance away, is just a tall pinnacle of rock, and it is a big gannet colony. Now, time passed, and there was no sign of anybody coming back. And it was the day of the wedding, so they didn't know what to do because they still didn't have a groom. But they thought, well, all the food's been made, we'll just carry on anyway and have the wedding meal, have the feast. So they did. There was lots to eat, there was lots to drink, there was music. It was a fine gathering, but it was just the only person missing was the groom. But they were sure that he would turn up. He knew when he was getting married, and he would be there. Now, when the men had arrived at Sulskerry, there was a big number of seals on the rocks there, and they all set up a loud noise and headed off down to the sea. And they went up onto the island, and there they found the bodies of Henry Graham and his friends. And what had happened was they had decided to go out there and, right enough, and shoot gannets. And they'd landed on Sulskerry, but they'd forgotten their guns in the boat. And they also hadn't secured the boat properly. So when they went down to look for get the guns out the boat wasn't there. It had drifted off to sea. And there was nothing that they could do about it. And with no water on the island, they didn't last long. And probably exposure as well. You're 36 miles out in the middle of the North Atlantic, And there's no shelter because it's just a flat island. And in those days, no lighthouse. It was just an island. Just a flat rock. Well, turf covered, but no shelter. And as they had lain there dead, the seabirds that they had gone to feasted on them. So they were torn and in a hell of a state. So they took them bodies down to the boat anyway, and they headed over back to Stromness. And they managed to land just below the house. Now, there was an old woman called Annie Fee, who was regarded as a wandering lunatic, as the story calls her. And she was dressed in an array of rags of different colours, and she had a corset made of straw, and she was a strange-looking figure. And she knocked on the door of the house. And they opened the door thinking, it's him back, And they opened the door and it was just old Annie. And she said, oh my, what a grand gathering. What a happy gathering there is here. It's such a joyous gathering. And a bonny lot of meat and drink here as well. Lots of food, lots of drink. Oh, it's a bonny bridal, and it'll mak a fine burial as well. And then she turned around and left. And they closed the door, of course, upset and a bit shaken by this. And after a while, they heard voices down at the beach, and they thought, it's him, he's back. So they went down to search, to see, to welcome him back, and Helen ran down to the shore with her arms spread wide, ready to throw it around the neck of her man and hug him. And then she realised that it was all the people that had gone searching for them. And the look on their face kind of said it all. And when she looked in the boat, she looked into where the eyes would have been on Henry Graham, her lover. And they said that the shock of it, she lost her wit.
Oh.
And she went into a decline and died pretty much right away. And so she was laid in a grave alongside Henry Graham. They didn't share a bed in life, but they shared a grave. And she was buried in her wedding dress.
Oh.
So, if you're going out to Sulskerry, make sure your boat's secure.
Yeah. Ooh. Wow. And that's supposed to be a true story.
Well, it's supposed to be based on a true story. I don't know whether it is or not. But there actually was a case when a boatload of men for Gramsci went to Sulskerry and were, to hunt gannet and were lost. I think it sank on the way back and they were all lost. Because in the old statistical account for the 1790s, it says about that tragedy, and they said that there's hardly any young men on the island because they were all lost on that boat. Now, death customs. Rainbows, again, appear here, but they're not making a brig for somebody that, no. If a rainbow was seen with both its ends in a township, that meant that somebody in that township would die soon. Now, a township was long time ago, medieval times, farms were clustered together, the buildings. And people had the strips of good ground that they could grow crops on in run rigs. So it was like a long furrow, long and narrow, I think about 4 feet wide by however long, And people also, they didn't have the same piece of ground, like one big long patch. They had individual strips, and it was mixed all over the place, so that some people had good ground, but you also had bad ground as well. So it kept it fair, meant that nobody, had an upper hand. And then there was a big turf dike built all the way around the township, because, well, a lot of the time they were on that fertile ground next to the sea. So you would have the sea maybe as a boundary on one side, and then you'd have a big sort of semicircular turf wall built all the way around it, which kept animals and geese out of the crops. So if you were growing bear, barley, you didn't want your cattle in it. So the cattle, sheep, and geese were all driven out onto the hill land. So they were common land that they could just wander about and graze on. But it just kept them out of that. So that was a township. And that's, if a rainbow had both its ends in that township, then somebody was going to leave it fairly soon.
That's odd, because rainbows are usually considered good luck.
Mm-hmm. Well, they're also a fine form of transport for Nordic gods as well, who used to bifrost the flaming rainbow bridge to travel from Asgard, from their realm, down to Midgard, Middle-earth, which is where we live. So it has many connotations. Now, if a crow or a raven was seen flying over your house, or worse still, landing on the top of the house, then that was another surefire sign that somebody's days was numbered. And sometimes people actually had little tokens of it themselves. If you heard beautiful, sweet music playing, then you knew that you were near to death, because it was the angels kind of calling you. And Walter Trill Dennison had a story about a friend of his who was near death, just a young man. And he said that he didn't have any fear or dying, and he knew he'd be very dead soon. He says, "I won't see you again." And he said, "How do you know that?" And he said, "Because the other night I heard such beautiful music that I knew that I would be going soon, but that heaven was waiting for me." So he was quite happy about dying. He had no fear of it. And sure enough, he died about the following day or so. Another thing that could show the approach of death was the death jack. The death jack was a ticking sound. So if you're in a house and there's a ticking, then it's not a clock. It's the death jack announcing that your days are numbered. Now, I don't know if you've ever heard it. I've heard it plenty when I was young, because I was in an old house, and it had woodworm. Oh. And the beetle lays an egg on a piece of wood. The larvae burrows its way in, and then munches its way through the wood for about 3 years. until it comes up near the surface, pupates, turns into a beetle, and then eats its way out. So the big holes that you see is usually exit holes. But while they're in there, whether as grubs or as beetles, I don't know, but they tick. So you'll just hear this tick, 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 tick. And you go, what the hell's that? And there's no sign of anything, but you get this tick, 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 tick. And it's a woodworm.
Well, that's a relief.
Mm-hmm. They didn't know that. They thought, oh, we're screwed. The other thing, which this is something that I really love. And Philip Pullman, you did not come up with something new. It was believed that in Orkney everybody had a varden. And a varden was an animal spirit that followed you throughout life. It was always invisible, but it was there with you. And at the end of your time, the varden would start to wail and cry. And they said sometimes if your varden was like in the shape of a dog, they would hear the sound of padding footsteps going from the house towards the kirkyard. And they knew that time was short and the varden was going to the kirkyard. So you would be following soon after. Now that's probably the same as the Bocky Hound of the Balfours, who lived in Notland Castle in Westray, which was built by the Balfours. No. They had a Bocky Hound, a ghost dog, that lived under the big main staircase there in a small room. And it would send up a howl when it was somebody was going to die, member of the family. So that was something that was actually reported within the last 20 years that
wow.
I'd heard that somebody had phoned a Balfour to say that a relation had died. And I think they lived in Edinburgh, and they said, yes, I was expecting that. And they said, well, we weren't, so how were you? And they said, well, I heard the dog howl the other night.
In Edinburgh?
Mm-hmm.
So it moved with them.
Mm-hmm. Well, it just goes around and informs everybody. So, another sign of death was a ganfer. No, it's a strange word because you get an expression here, a ganfer for snow. No, I never used that. I never heard that. I know it's a thing, but I never heard it being used. But a ganfer for snow meant snow was coming. It was gathering. But a ganfer, in this case, is the ghost of a person who isn't dead yet, but will die very soon. And the earlier it's seen in the morning, then the closer to death they are. In the afternoon means that they're going to live for a bit longer. But it's just the apparition of that person. And sometimes they're carrying something that relates to the mode of their death. So you get maybe a man will be soaking wet and carrying a piece of seaweed, so you know he's going to drown. There was also a story in Westray about an old woman that was seen there, and she had a rope in one hand and an assy cubby in the other, so an ash basket. And they said it was hardly surprising because she was a witch, and that day she was worried at the stake in Kirkwall, so strangled with a piece of rope, and then her body burnt to ash. So that was her ganfer. And I actually knew somebody who's seen a ganfer. It was old Willie Thompson in Neven in North Ronaldsay. And he didn't tell me this himself, but I heard it on a recording he did for Radio Orkney. And he said his grandmother was ill, and she'd been lying in bed for a while. And one day he seen her walking past the window of the house. So he ran to his mother and he says, "Oh, Granny's surely feeling a lot better because she's up and about." And he says, no, what? And he says, well, I just seen her walking past the window. And she knew then that this was a ganther that he'd seen, so it was the spirit of the old woman.
Is it the same thing as a doppelganger?
Could be.
Pretty much.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's meant to be the spirit of someone who isn't dead yet.
I've always heard doppelgangers just being used as like somebody that really looks like somebody else.
Oh.
But I don't know. I mean, you're probably right. Well, I mean, it can be used as both.
Yeah, I suppose.
Because, you know, it's the same thing, kind of thing. Now, dreams can also foretell these things. You'll be pleased about this.
I can.
If you dream of a ship sailing over land, then that is a sign that somebody that you know that are close to you is going to die. Especially sometimes the ship is seen sailing over land towards the kirkyard. Then that's a surefire sign. Another thing as well is if you dream about losing teeth, then that means that you will lose family member. And depending on the number of teeth you lose, well, that shows the number of family members who will die. And there was a wee boy dreamt that he was standing in front of a beautiful green mound. And he looked down and 6 of his teeth had fallen out and was lying on the green grass, very white and shiny. And then he woke up. And when he told his mother that, she was quite alarmed about this because she knew the belief. And they said, soon after that, there was a boat lost, and it was all members of their family, like cousins and such like. And they had all drowned, and there was 6 of them. So he got it absolutely spot on. Now, when you've finally gone through all the sort of checks and clues that you're going to die and all that, and you actually get around to doing it, the body was laid out with the feet pointing towards the door, and a saucer containing salt was placed on the chest. Now, Denison says that when he asked old people about why they did that, they said they did it because they'd always done it. You know, it was just the custom. And, but I have read since then, there was a book I have of stories and customs from the Isle of Man, and which lies in the Irish Sea, just south of the Western Isles, between Scotland or England on the one side and Ireland on the other. Can't remember how far south it is. My geography's letting me down here. But anyway, it was Sodor it was referred to. It was the Sudreyar was the Vikings called. The Southern Islands were what we call the Western Isles or Hebrides. And then Sodor was the Isle of Man, which was regarded as being one of the same group. Although it's not now, it's kind of semi-independent. And anyway, in the book about the Isle of Man, it said that they would take a bowl of salt mixed with earth and place on the breast of the corpse because it represented the soil, represented the clay, the body of the person that would go back to earth again. And the salt represented their immortal soul that would stay pure and clean. Now, I think it's John Firth in Reminiscences on Orkney Parish also mentions that the bowl of salt on the chest was believed to stop the body from swelling with gases. Can't imagine it would do any good whatsoever, but maybe it was believed that it would help in some way.
And of course, salt works against supernatural powers.
probably that. I think you hit the nail on the head. I think it was just the case that salt could break magic spells, could break curses, and drive away evil. So, yeah, having the salt on it would be a protection against any evil spirits. And there was plenty around looking for the corpse, because you couldn't leave it alone. You had to sit with it.
Just like all these other times, the births and pregnancies and marriages, it's the time of vulnerability.
Yeah, its evil spirits could get at it. And the chin was propped up with a Bible. And, of course, when you die, I mean, your jawbone isn't attached to anything. It's, you know, your muscles give up and the jaw drops, so you have to kind of prop it up. Hence Marley's ghost with his handkerchief tied around his head. But they used the Bible to prop it up until rigor mortis set in, and then it would remain there. But a Bible was always kept in the room along with a candle. There was always light and the Bible, and people sat with the dead. And there was, people had to, the people that sat with it, sometimes there'd be quite a gathering. Sometimes somebody would take a fiddle down and there would be music. So there could actually be quite a bit of merriment going on. And some horseplay as well, which we would consider in extremely poor taste these days. But there was a case given by Denison, I think, of a young woman who had fallen asleep, and so they pinned the arm of the dead body, the shroud, you know, to her with a safety pin. And then they sort of gave her a fright, and she chumped up, and of course the hand came up with her. And but it had tragic consequences, because it says that the shock drove her from her senses. And she was,
not her too.
Yes, that's a common occurrence with you ladies, losing your wits at sudden frights. So I'll have to make sure I don't flag you or something.
Yes, don't frighten me.
Yeah. There was another story about a guy that before you left, you had to touch the corpse, and you had to touch the feet of the corpse in case, to stop it from haunting you, to stop it from walking with you.
Yeah.
There was a man at the Leakwak, as it was known, and
like a wake.
Yeah, it'd be the same name, I'd imagine. And he had been sitting with this guy, and he'd been having a drink as well, because there was plenty of booze being circulated. Now, this man and him had always had a bit of kind of an up and down relationship, and the man had said, more in jest than anything else, that if he died first, then he would come and haunt him. And then the guy had fallen asleep, and they had tossed him into a bed. And he woke up eventually, a bit worse for wear, and he set off from the house, and they said, remember to touch the corpse. And he put his hand down, but he couldn't bear to touch it. He was horrified at this dead body, and also worried about the fact that this guy had said he would come back and haunt him. And he left without touching the feet of the man. And as he was walking home, he realized that something was next to him, because he could see a white shape out the corner of his eye. And the faster he walked, it kept up at exactly the same pace as him, till in the end he started running, and the white shape was still there. It was still going at exactly the same speed that he was. And he ran all the way home, and he burst through the door, and he was gasping for breath. And his wife says, "Oh, mercy, what a state you're in. And you've obviously been sleeping at that house. And he says, how do you know that? And she goes, you got a big white feather stuck in your hair. So, not always bad. When somebody died, I don't know why, before any cat lovers write in, but cats were always locked up. Cats were never allowed to go near the body or look at the body. And also mirrors were covered as well. Mm-hmm. I think the belief was that they may reflect the soul of the person, and maybe it wasn't the soul you wanted to look at. So mirrors were...
I heard something somewhere about the spirit might get confused or something, or... Yeah, it had something to do with the spirit needing to leave and getting confused or stuck or something.
Stuck in the mirror, right? Yeah. So you look in the mirror and there's Grandad looking back at you every time you're trying to shave. That would be a bit off-putting. There was a story about a man from Ower who had got into trouble with a Kirk session because when his wife died, he had placed corn, barley, in her mouth and between her fingers and between her toes, and then cast more in on top of her chest. And the presbytery, obviously thinking there was something pagan, or worse still, something papist going on, pulled him in there and rebuked him for it and asked him to explain his actions. And he said that this woman was his second wife, and that he had had a daughter with his first wife, and the stepmother hated the daughter, and that he was feared that she would haunt her. She would come back and haunt the daughter. And so the steps that he had taken was to prevent the ghost from rising. She was then stuck in the coffin and couldn't come out and cause trouble. Oh. So, when somebody died, you never used their name again till after they were buried. Mm. They were always just referred to as, the one that was Tina Y or something like that. You never referred to them by name as bad luck. Mm. Why, I'm not sure. But you never named the person.
It was the same kind of idea of keeping them bound to earth.
Could be. I mean, there's stories, folk tales about somebody who laments so much over the loss of a loved one. The woman who weeps so much for her husband, and he comes to her in a dream and he's soaking wet and he says, I can't get any peace because the tears that you cry fall on me and I am wet the whole time and I can't rest in peace until you stop grieving for me. So, now, the coffin, they had this, they called it a kestin. When the body was taken and placed in the coffin, that was called a kestin, or kestin, chest.
So when they were laid out,
yeah,
they would have just been on a table, or were they in the coffin?
They were in the bed, usually.
Oh, in the bed.
And it was also thought as being bad luck. Well, not bad luck, disrespectful to bury somebody too quickly. Right. It was usually about 3 weeks after the death that the person was buried. No, I guess that in the height of summer, if it was warm, then they wouldn't have kept them for that long for obvious reasons. But it was looked on as being that, you had to leave them for a respectable period of time because it looked like you couldn't wait to get them out of the house. You couldn't wait to get rid of them. It was like, hooray, he's gone.
Maybe a transitionary time too for the person. Like they needed to get used to the fact that they were dead and we're going to be moving on.
Yeah. It's like the old man that was asked what he would like. What he would like for this, to eat. And he says, I would like the morning soup the day. So tomorrow's soup today, because soup's always better after a day. It gets much more flavour. There was the story of the old man that was lying in bed dying. And his wife was making soup, and it smelt so good. And he said, "Can I get a plate of that soup?" And she says, "No, it's for the funeral." Sometimes sentimentality didn't really come into this. Now, the coffin would be set on 2 chairs once the body was in the coffin. 2 chairs were brought in, and it was sitting, either end of that, head and feet. And after the coffin was lifted, both the chairs had to be kicked over, because if you didn't do that, the next person that sat in the chair would be the next one to die. Oh. It was dangerous. Now, the straw that was in the mattress under the body was also taken out and burnt. And it was looked at later to see if there was any footprints in it, because there may be the footprints of the next person to die would walk through the ashes. The coffin was carried to the kirk. And like I've said, with christenings and with marriages, this could be several miles away. And sometimes very rough terrain. And if it was a portly gentleman or lady, bloody heavy as well, so it's a long labour. So you needed people, you needed more than just your pallbearers. You needed people who would be able to take turns at carrying the coffin. And they would need a break regularly, because you couldn't set the coffin down on the earth, just on the ground. That would allow evil spirits to get into it and do harm to the soul. The soul was believed to be very vulnerable until you were in a kirkyard in consecrated soil, and then you were safe. Mm-hmm. But they had resting places called wheeling stains, so the stones that you would then set the coffin on so that it wasn't sitting on the ground. Mm-hmm. Denison says that it was also known as wheel de cruise in Sandy, but wheeling stains is probably more common. And then they would have a drink, and a little refreshment would be left at the wheeling stains. So they would have a dram, fortify themselves, and carry on. Now, there was one occasion when there was a man who had a reputation of being a bit dodgy, a bit of a dabbler, possibly in the black arts. And when he died, he was a very heavy man. So they were kind of struggling down the road with him. And in front of the coffin, there was going a man ringing a handbell, because churches had their own handbells, and that was used before a coffin at a funeral.
Oh, that's why there are so many handbells on the symbols on the stones at the cathedral.
Yeah, it's a symbol of death. Along with, the hourglass, the spade, the turf cutter, all these things are sort of signs that you've gone. Candles. So there's all these symbolic things, as well as the death head, of course, the skull and crossbones, because the long bones are the ones that last longest, and that's what people would be used to seeing, So this man is being carried off to his grave anyway, and the handbell is being rung before them. And then suddenly, just out of nowhere, there's a terrible gale of wind blows up. And the man with the handbell, he drops the handbell and he can't find it. And they're all searching for the bell, but there's no sign of it. And they think it must have fallen down a rabbit hole and been lost. And this wind's raging away like mad. And then, just as quickly as it started, it stopped. And the bell was lying at their feet, in clear view of everyone, what it hadn't been before. So they thought, this is mighty odd. So then they went and picked up the coffin, and it was light. So they reckon that the devil had come for them. Oh. But didn't have the power to do anything while that handbell was being rung, a church bell. There was actually a wee story that when Earl Robert Stewart of evil memory died in Orkney, was buried in the cathedral, his son Patrick borrowed handbills from several of the local parish churches. There was a few at the cathedral, but he borrowed more, so there was 12 in the end. And then they were all rung as they were taking Robert to his grave, which he would need, because he was an evil bugger. So, But they said that all the ones that Patrick borrowed, he never replaced, never returned.
Oh.
So he was...
It's the beginning of his reign.
Yeah.
Said a lot.
Everybody thought, oh, Robert Stuart's dead. Thank God for that. Oh, Patrick, he can't be any worse than his feather. Wrong. Anyway, there was a story that I don't know I should tell this one or not, but an old friend of mine told me when I was doing this, so as a much shorter talk, and he said, "Boy," he says, "I mind just after the war there was a funeral in Evie, and the fella that they were burying was a big fat fella. It was a hell of a heavy coffin, and folk were really struggling under the weight of it. And they had their stopping places, their wheeling stands, stop there and have a drink and all that. And then they picked up the coffin last time, and they were carrying it down the road, and they thought, hey, that's funny, it's awful light. He was a very heavy guy, and suddenly it's all very light. So they checked, and the bottom had come out of the coffin.
Oh.
It was just after the war, and materials was scarce. And so the wood the coffin was made of was far too flimsy to support the weight of the guy. And when they had picked it up, the nails just came out and left the body on the base of the floor of the coffin.
Having had a little refreshment, they didn't notice.
Yeah, well, that was implied. But they went back anyway, and then they said, well, what can we do? Because we don't have another coffin or anything. So they just turned the coffin over and put him in the coffin upside down and shoved the floor back over him as the lid and carried him down, and he was buried in an upside down coffin. So there you go. But carrying the coffin to the kirkyard, again, it was regarded as good luck to cross running water. But of course that all kind of depended, because there was once that a funeral party was trying to cross running water in Harry, and there had been a sudden thaw of snow, and the burn was in spate. And as they were trying to cross it, they lost their footing, and the coffin fell in the burn and went scooshing off like whitewater rafting down the burn, and ended up in the loch, in the Harry Loch.
Oh, no.
Where it sank. And then they had to get a boat out with grappling hooks to try to lift the coffin up.
They wouldn't have left it there. It wouldn't have been in consecrated ground.
No, well, nobody wanted to have them. Was not wanting to be buried at, well, not at sea, but
At Loch.
at Loch. If you seen a dog running across the path of a funeral, then the dog had to be tracked down and killed.
Oh.
It was believed to be terribly bad luck, bad omen for you. And the dog had to be seized and killed. It was considered to be really bad luck to, if you saw another funeral party as well, because you had to be the first in, because they believed that the first, like marriages, the first one to be buried got a bigger blessing and got into heaven quicker than the second one.
Like there were only so many for the day.
Yeah.
You wanted to make sure you got your share.
Yeah, it's kind of like, right, no, well, you'll have to wait until tomorrow. There's a bench over there, you just wait. So you ended up with a race, between two guys carrying the coffin. So
Or some heart attacks waiting to happen.
There was a sketch by Dave Allen about that, actually, an Irish comedian. It was very funny. They ended up with a coffin sticking out the sunroof of a Volkswagen Beetle or something as it was tearing up the road. It was really bad luck if somebody entered the kirkyard before the coffin. Mm-hmm. That meant you would be the next in there. So you had to be very careful. And the coffin then had to be taken with the course of the sun around the grave to be buried. And it used to be the case that the next of kin had to throw in the first shovelful, the nearest kin, so a wife or, a parent or whatever had to throw in the first shovelful of earth. Suicides weren't allowed to be buried in kirkyards, and as we know, Betty Corrigal buried on the boundary between the parishes of Hoy and Was, and so they weren't allowed in. When eventually it was they relaxed the rule, then the suicide couldn't go in through the gate. They had to pass it over the wall into the kirkyard for whatever reason. I mean, obviously, it was showing contempt or disapproval at the people for what had happened, what they had done. But empathy was not a very important thing in the old Presbyterian kirk, I mean, things are very, very different these days, of course, but back then it was very much frowned upon. And shipwrecked sailors weren't buried in kirkyards either. They were buried next to the sea where the body had come in.
But for a different reason.
Well, yeah, because they believed that the sea claimed a certain number of prey every year, and that it would, if you took it away from it, buried in the kirkyard, then the sea would flow over and try to get into the kirkyard. A lot of them are by the sea. And they would try to flood it and sort of get at the body. And you didn't want your own family members or ancestors to be all soggy on account of some stranger that you didn't know. Also, there is the suggestion as well that it was just sheer bigotry, prejudice, because you didn't know whether that person may have been a Catholic or a Jew. More likely to be that in those days than Muslim, but still a possibility. There was sailors from all around the world on these things, so you didn't know what religion they were. So you could be burying them in a Presbyterian Protestant graveyard, and they weren't of that denomination. So they were buried down by the shore.
Yeah.
Sometimes they were, the burials were marked with a stone. There's a grave on the Outer Homes, which you've seen, which has got a stone up at it and a little cairn built around it. It was supposed to be a drowned sailor that was washed ashore there, and they just buried it on the island. So these things did happen.
Yeah.
Now, it was considered that being buried at the north end of the kirkyard that's where the poor people were buried, where the south end was considered to be much more.
That was the fashionable.
Yeah, well, that
cemetery.
was the kind of the best bet, So even in death, people can make distinctions of, well, I've got a better grave than you. You come up for a haunting at night. You go lording about. Oh, I'm at the south end. Now, there was a very sad story, and it kind of resonates with me now because it involved my own family. But when a bairn died before being christened, it wasn't allowed to be buried in the kirkyard because it hadn't been given a name. And you had to... They're very bureaucratic in heaven, apparently, because if you haven't got a name, you're not coming in. It's like you can have a private party and your name's not on the list. Bugger off. So you couldn't get into heaven unless you had a name. And there was a few stories about this. One that Denison told about a baby that died was born in a house where there was a fever. A father and two of their older siblings had this fever. The baby was born and died very soon after, so it wasn't named, but it was buried in the kirkyard. But one night he was out hunting for rabbits, been poaching, and the fog came down and he ended up next to the kirkyard, and he saw a white shape and he thought it was a colt of his called Stumpy. And he said, away home with you, Stumpy. And then it rose up into the air in a glorious, brilliant white flame, and a child's voice came from under the flame and said, "Thank you, Father, for giving me a name. I can find peace now." Because he'd been called Stumpy.
Well, it's better than nothing.
Well, there are worse.
Yes.
There's a story from that Trowie Marwick tells from the Bay of Scale, from St. Peter's Kirk, where a bairn had died, again, just very soon after birth. They hadn't had it christened yet. And the minister wouldn't allow it to be buried in the kirkyard. And so he was determined that the bairn should be buried. And it winter and it started to snow, so he went down to the graveyard, and he dug a grave for it, and he buried the bairn. And it was covered with snow, so nobody was any the wiser. But when the snow melted, they could see where the disturbed earth was, and of course they guessed that this is probably what he had done. And then a local farmer that used to graze his cattle in the field next to the kirk, the cattle refused to go in it. They were scared. And down at the end of the slope, there was a bairn's ghost was seen sitting, crying, weeping. And people were scared of it, so they wouldn't go near it. But one guy, who was a bit braver than the rest, went over to the bairn and said, "What's wrong with your bare back?" And with that, the crying stopped and the baby disappeared because he'd been given a name, Bareback. Now, Trowie Marwick was telling this story to a young men's mutual improvement association in Sandwich, and it was being then reported in the Orcadian newspaper. It was being published and in full, which is where I got all that information from. I mean, I gathered it together and transcribed it, and it's in a book. Now, Trowie Marwick used to be a master storyteller, with my friend James Irvin, who took over a lot of the work. If it wasn't for him, it would never be in print. Or maybe from Orkneyology press, I don't know. But anyway, that was the story that was printed in the Orcadian, early 1900s. There is a version of the similar story from Dernis. There's a mound there called Howduak, and or maybe even just Howdu. I've had it pronounced different ways, but Howduak is how it's spelled. There was a young woman who was a farm servant, and she had a baby out of wedlock, and she murdered the baby. She kept the pregnancy as quiet as she could, murdered the baby as soon as it was born, and buried it on the mound because nobody would disturb a mound. I mean, the fairy, home of the fairies, so it was a place that nobody would look. And then people started hearing the sound of a baby weeping as it went along the road, as they were walking along the road. Past that, there would be the sound of a baby would start wailing and crying and follow you along the road. People were scared of this, because it was obviously a ghost baby. And at Smittybanks, just up the brae, there was an ale house. And there was a guy that was up there the one night, and he'd had a few, and he was walking back home, and he had to pass the mound, and he heard the baby coming greeting behind him. And he said to it, "How do I with your bare ears?" So like, go away, bare arse, or bare ass if you're in America. And the crying stopped because the baby had been given a name, bare arse. And I suspect that would have been the original punchline, as it were, of Chorley Marwick's story, not bareback. Why would he call anybody bareback unless you were riding a horse without a saddle? So I suspect that he'd cleaned that up. Now, Walter Traill Dennison said that there was a young couple went to him in 1842 and asked him to write the name of their child on a slip of paper, because the belief was that if the baby couldn't get into heaven because it hadn't been christened and given a name, if it had a name on a piece of paper pinned to its shroud, then he described it as a passport to paradise. You would get in. You would get into heaven then.
It's like putting a little tag on your kid so if they get lost, you've got their name and address and everything.
Well, it was like when bairns were being evacuated during the war, at the beginning of World War II, and they were worried about air raids with some justification, as it turned out, and they evacuated all the children to country areas to be taken in by some people, some of them not very nice. But they all had a luggage label tied to them as well, with their names on it. And which I think was inspiration as well for Paddington Bear, with the luggage label on them saying, please look after this bear, or whatever it was, I think that was probably, I wouldn't be surprised if that was influenced by the bairns that were evacuated during the war. But Dennison said that this young couple in 1842, they couldn't write. So they went to him, knowing that he was a man of letters, and asked him to write the name of the baby on the slip of paper so he could pin it to the shroud. And he was kind of saying that was something that had happened in the past, but he had thought that it was something that had died out. But it was still there in 1842. Now, 70 years later, in 1912, I discovered my great-uncle did exactly the same thing for his stillborn son. My mother told me it when I was speaking to her about this, because my friend Professor Bo Amquist, who was a great old guy, folklorist and saga expert and all-around good egg, he used to phone me up and say, Tom, he was Swedish, Tom, do you have the story of the midwife among the fairies? And I'd say, yes, Boo, it's in the book I wrote that I gave you, So, do you know, he says, I read in Walter Traill Dennison about this story of the baby getting the name, and I didn't know it from Orkney before, and this was very exciting. And I said, yeah, I've got another 2 if you want, which at that time, well, Marwick's had been published in the Arcadian in 1903 or whenever the hell it was. But the one for Dearness was just an oral tradition. So I passed this on to him, but I was talking to my mother on the phone and I mentioned that. And she said, oh yeah, Uncle Johnny did that when his bairn died. And I said, because I remember him. He was an old man when I was a bairn. He died just short of his 96th birthday. He was one of twins. He was mostly known in Westray as Trousdale, because his middle name was Trousdale, because that was the name of the doctor that delivered him, because he had a twin sister, and the doctor had never delivered twins before, and he asked if they would put in the name. Just the same as me, middle name Stewart, from Betty Stewart, my midwife, who also asked if she could have a child named after her.
At least they didn't name you Betty.
Well, there's that consolation, yeah. But she said, oh yeah, Uncle Johnny did that. And that shocked me, because of course somebody that I knew, somebody that I probably shouldn't have known, it was sheer luck, because he was called up in World War One. He did not want to go to the army. I mean, he was not somebody that wanted to kill anyone. And he wouldn't go to any of the commemorations, any of the remembrance days at the War Memorial. And he wouldn't put on his medals. He wouldn't go there. But the story that I heard was that he was he'd killed well, it was always told me as a chairman guy with his bayonet, and he never forgave himself for that very brutal, very close-hand death. And I heard later from an old friend of his that he said, no, he was out in... Turns out, I think he was in Salonika in the Black Watch. He was in the Seaforths to start with, which was the regiment that all people in Orkney was, but he ended up in the Black Watch. And I think he was in a work division out in Salonika, northern Greece. And he said he was fighting the Bulgars. And I thought, well, I hope not, because they were actually on our side during World War One. But they had overrun the trench. And before he left, he was not going to take his pocket watch with him, but his wife, I think, had said, you should take your pocket watch. So he was wearing it, and where the guy struck him on the breast, jumped over the trench and stabbed him with his bayonet, had Uncle Johnny's pocket watch, and he then thrust his bayonet in him and also fired a rifle as well, apparently, and killed him. But like I said, he never forgave himself for that. But then just to add more misery onto the story of him as well, in 1912, his wife, Catherine, or Kitty as she was known, was just about at full term with her pregnancy. And they were living in the house that belonged to her parents, and they were kelp workers. Sure enough, I've looked it up on the census, and they are down there from the year before, 1911, and they are listed as kelp workers, and he's listed as a carter. So he had a horse and cart, and he used to go off and pick up goods from the pier and then take it to the shops or wherever it was going. And this one day when he was leaving to go for the cart, he said to his wife, no, don't go to the kelp today. Don't make kelp because you're too near your time. But her father made her go down to the shore and cart up heavy, wet seaweed. And it caused her to have a miscarriage. And the baby was dead, wee boy. And he wrote George Draver on a slip of paper and pinned to the shroud. And when I said to Mother, that was a really old tradition, and I told her that story, and she goes, oh, he wouldn't have kent about that. And I thought, of course he bloody knew about it. Why else would he have done it? He wouldn't have just made up, coincidence that he made up something that had been going on for centuries. But he buried the bairn in the kirkyard at Pierwell, and there was a stone put up to George Draver, and then he's buried there with his wife as well, but she never had any more children after that. I don't think she could. So it's a tough old world, but...
It does. I mean, it does make you appreciate what we do have now. I think sometimes it's easy to bemoan certain things, that go on now that we wish didn't, but... We do have a much better chance of survival anyway,
Oh yeah, we're
from birth onwards.
Yeah, we certainly do,
and a lot easier as far as work and just everything.
Yeah, and there's no pricks dropping bombs on us or firing missiles at us as well, which is something that we should be grateful for. Mm-hmm. Not everybody can say that these days, unfortunately. So, on that cheerful note. It's been a bit of a weird one, this, because it really hasn't gone the way I expected it to. And I forgot to tell the story about the long wedding at Notland Castle, but it's on Tales for Troubled Times. You can find it there.
which is on our website.
Yeah, so you can find all that stories, about 170-something stories, ranging from a few minutes to 2 hours. But anyway, thank you very much for listening, folks. And I hope you find your way safely home with the moon still shining. So until next month, good night.
Good night.